For me, this week has been really joyful because of the release of the hostages, the living ones, some of the deceased ones. When the reporter called me this week, I had been reading a book that had just come out I think it came out in September, and it was kind of about where we're at, where the Jewish people are at in faith and with anti-Semitism and all that. And it kind of got me hyped up about, proud to be a Jew kind of thing. And so when the reporter called, it was like, yeah. I mean, I didn't even hesitate about being on camera and being interviewed. It was like, yep, we're going to do this thing. Hallelujah. Because there's always this little hesitation going on with anti-Semitism and anti-Israel and anti-Judaism and all of that stuff, which maybe I'll talk about after Oneg a little bit. But one of the things that I said was that the ceasefire agreement had not been fulfilled yet because they hadn't returned all of the deceased. And it still hasn't been. The deadline has passed and was not honored by Hamas, which is not a huge surprise. They still remind me of not that I would have had any experience in this, but the playground bully, who says, yeah, we're not going to get into anything today. I'm not going to beat you up today. And then they go and beat you up. So it's not a surprise that Hamas hasn't honored anything. And as you're aware, or may not be aware, now the tribal warfare is going on, and people are just killing people. It's not a good thing over there. There's a strong sense of victory in having had the living hostages released. But the bodies are important too. And the reason why is that they need to be brought home for proper burial. It's very, very important for the Jewish people and for Israel to do that. And we learned that in Genesis with the great care given to Sarah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph when they died, or their bones were buried and taken care of. So Hamas just doesn't have any respect for the living or the dead, and that ought to remind you of Satan, because he has no interest in anybody else other than himself. And I also told the reporter that peace would come, a temporary peace, only when Hamas was disarmed. Hamas is violent. That's what Hamas means in Hebrew. The violence that it advocates runs deep in the culture. And there's just really no real undoing of it, because they just need to be disarmed. Saw a story today where one of the leaders said, we might agree to that for 3 or 5 years, and then we want to be armed again. So this just is a continual cycle. So true peace will come when the Lord returns. One of the readings for this week, Ezekiel 28, says, starting in verse 25, thus says Adonai Elohim, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the people among whom they are scattered, and show my holiness through them in the eyes of the nations, then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They will live safely there, and they will build houses and plant vineyards. And we've seen the state of Israel and how that land has changed since 1948. And then it says in verse 26, they will live securely when I have executed judgments on all those around them that treated them with contempt. So they will know that I am Adonai, their God. All the nations that come against Israel will be judged by God. And I think those executing judgments on all of those is not going to be a pleasant experience for those folks. But it's promised. It's promised that it is going to happen. So that's looking into the future. It's looking forward to a day when everything will be set right and the violence will be replaced by peace or shalom or order, which brings us to today and looking at Genesis. Today we're looking at Genesis, a book that sets up the rest of the Bible. We tend to blow through Genesis 1 through 6 and maybe a good chunk of Genesis and not really dive deep into it when we're reading it. And yet there's so much in Genesis that just lays out everything else that's going to happen all the way through Revelation. And so we really need to look deeply at it. Today we're just going to look at a very small portion of it so that you will be enticed to really dive deep into it. And it's a big book. There's a lot of material in it. Like the rest of the Bible, Genesis is layered with meaning. And we'll start to unpack that a little bit this morning. And I hope, too, to unveil the relationship with God and through Genesis that we have. Because these concepts, continue through Revelation, and the one we're going to look at today, I think, will be very, very useful, or else I wouldn't be talking about it, right? Frankly. But then again, maybe I talk about useless stuff all the time. When we really start to think about how God created man, or Adam, out of the dust of God's creation and breathed life into him, and then took woman from Adam, we witness a deep personal connection between God and those two that he made in his image. He breathed life into them. They were formed. And they were in the Garden of Eden with God. And so this was a very deep personal relationship that we ought to have with him as well. There are many different ways that we can look at the concept of being made in the image of God. Does it mean physical or spiritual? Moral, a combination of those, perhaps something entirely different. How did the fall in the Garden of Eden change that image? Those are really good questions, ones that you need to think about. I was thinking one way that we're no longer completely in the image of God is that we get sick. Not just our thoughts that go astray. We get physically ill. We have mental things that go on with anxiety and stuff like that God doesn't have. And so in those ways, we're no longer in his image, but we are being renewed. So let's start at the beginning, chapter 1. And first of all, we notice that God's existence is assumed. There is no discussion in the creation story about how God came about, how the Spirit came about. It's just assumed that God exists. And where did the elements that were pieced together for creation, where did they come from? Doesn't say. It's just assumed. We're forced to be in a position of acknowledging that God exists and that all the matter that he used to make or create just existed. Nowhere in the text is it asking for our opinion on any of that. So the Bible assumes right from the get-go that God exists, that the almighty, everlasting creator of all things exists. We're not asked anything about that. We're not asked to give an opinion on it. The Bible is not seeking to prove to you that he exists. He just does. And from here on, whoever continues to read the Bible or listen to it must know and understand that God exists and accept that, because God isn't asking for your opinion, nor is the Bible. And if you made it past the first sentence or two, you should be accepting that God exists in order to make it through the rest of the Bible. So that's the first lens that we look through when we read the Bible. We know that God exists. And not only that, but God is all-powerful, all-knowing. He is speaking formless matter into intricate things. He is organizing chaos and putting it in the right order. And not just any order, it's His order. There's perfection to it. And He is unlike the gods of Egypt and Mesopotamia in that. He is singular. He is all-powerful. He is all-knowing. He is also unlike Egyptian and Mesopotamian gods with a small g, in that He desires a positive relationship with His creation, man and women and woman in particular. What is similar to the ideas from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt is that the people sought to know and understand how they fit into the world order, because that world order is the ideal. Things are ordered. How do we exist in that? And why are things seemingly disordered when we go through life? And also, law. Mesopotamia had law. They had writings of the law. The difference between their writings, really, one of the differences, and the Bible, the Torah, is that there are open-ended things in the Torah. And everything operates on an equal plane. The Torah applies to the rich, it applies to the poor, it applies to the kings, it applies to the peasants. It's equality. Other laws in Mesopotamia and Egypt didn't do those sorts of things. That's probably something more for when we get into Exodus and Leviticus. But Genesis starts out by telling us that creation by God was very much ordered and done so in a lot of detail. And humans are created out of creation itself rather than being spoken into existence. Genesis 2:7 says that Adonai Elohim formed man out of the dust of the ground, and He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life so that man became a living being. On one hand, I kind of would have liked to have been created just by the words. But that was left for cows and cats and dogs and chickens and all those reptiles and stuff like that. Instead, He made Adam out of the ground, out of the dust, out of the creation. And we learned that Adam is the caretaker of the earth. And then that man needs a counterpart. In Genesis 2:21, Adonai Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall on the man, and he slept. And He took one of the ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. And Adonai Elohim built the rib, which He had taken from the man, into a woman. And then He brought her to the man. And the man said, "This one at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one is called woman, for the man was taken this one." So a cow didn't work. Cat didn't work. Reptile didn't work. It was something that was from the man. So simple enough. We understand these things. And maybe since we were little kids, we understood how those things of creation were created and in perfect order, the way that God wanted to do it. And then something happens, something we're also should be fairly familiar with in Genesis chapter 3, where in verse 1 it says, "But the serpent was shrewder than any animal of the field that Adonai Elohim made." So it said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat all the trees of the garden, or of the garden, or eat from?" We're not supposed to eat the trees. There's the fruit there. "The woman said to the serpent, 'Of the fruit of the trees we may eat.' But of the fruit of the tree, which is in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat of it, you must not touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, you most assuredly won't die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And the serpent was right. She didn't immediately die, but death was on its way and prolonged. So, as usual, Satan tells a half-truth or a partial truth, not the whole thing. And I want you to keep that in mind. It's not a complete lie. It's part of. As Westerners, we define good and evil in moral terms. Scholars believe that sometime in the Middle Ages, the moral concept of good and evil became binary. Something is either good or it's bad. There's no in between. It's not sort of bad. It's not sort of good. It's either good or it's bad. However, in the ancient Near East, the concept of good, as we see it here in Genesis, means complete or in order. There's no moral value to this in ancient Near East thinking. It means complete. And so when we're reading this, we have to wipe out in our minds this concept that there was a morality involved in it. We also see here in Genesis that the idea of completeness or being in order, that the chaos that was in the world was transformed into order, God's perfect order. At the close of the days of creation, each day was complete or set in order. He said, this is good. And at some point he says, this is very good. And so there's this order that is taking place. I'm going to close this because it's driving me nuts. Noise isn't bad, but it bothers me sometimes. So do you get that? There's this completeness in that's in the Hebrew word good, and in the concept, the ancient Near East concept of completeness. So we must have something that counteracts that. We have the days, they're good or very good, set in order. The last day is very, very good. So if you're a Bible translator, you could say that after the sixth day of creation, it was perfectly ordered. It wasn't just ordered, it was perfectly ordered. It was very good. Which really sets us up for chapter 3. The Hebrew word translated evil has a root, and that root is ra. And when compared to Egyptian and Mesopotamian concepts or the ancient Near East concepts, a better translation for ra is unraveling. And so when you eat of the tree, you will know God's perfect order, and because of that, you will know how to unravel God's perfect order. That's the gist of it. It's not evil in the way that we might think of it today, where it's morally evil. The point that's being made here is that you will have knowledge of how to try to unravel the good or the order that God has created things in. So Genesis 1 through 11 sets us up with God transforming disorder or chaos into order. However, when Eve and Adam eat of the tree of good and evil, or the tree of order and disorder, they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and the humans are left constantly having to find their place within the world. Where's my place in this system that's supposed to be so well ordered? And the Hebrew root of the words used to describe evil has this sense of unraveling, as I've said. The root ra has a lot of derivations set in context if you do a search. But I think it's useful to think of the idea of unraveling God's order. It's not always used that way, but most of the time it is used that way in the Hebrew text. Sometimes there's a morality involved. But even in that, we can see that when you lie and cheat and steal and you're mean to somebody, evil things, you're unraveling God's perfect order, or having a part in unraveling it. When the fruit of the tree is eaten, Adam and Eve not only know God's order, but they know how to unravel it. And I think it's useful to look at things that way. Satan speaks in half-truths, words that unravel but don't completely unwind God's perfect order, only bits and pieces of it. And while I was thinking about this, I was thinking of maybe taking a strand of yarn in a spool thread and tying it in, and then you're able to unwind it, untwist it a little bit, but it's still there. And then you can twist it back up and make it strong again. And if we take the metaphor of the fabric of society, when we find that a human wants to break God's perfect order by stealing or murder, those I think are kind of extreme examples. Those things work to unravel God's order, unraveling the fabric of society. It's not a great metaphor, but it kind of works for me. So today, when we look at good and evil through the framework of morality, and we're wondering if something is evil or inherently evil, the question to ask is it unraveling God's perfect order? And I think that seems much more objective than the subjective idea of morality. Morality is subjective depending on the whim of society. What's right for you may not be right for me. What was right 100 years ago may not be right today morally. But in God's view of order, there's an absolute there. God's order of things is unchanging. We can easily read the Bible and see the order, beginning at the first chapter of Genesis and carrying on through Revelation. And it helps to explain stuff like Isaiah 45. In the King James version of Isaiah 45:7, it says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Does that mean that a holy God is capable of creating evil, moral evil? I think what it means is God created order, and because he knows how to create order out of things, he also knows how to unwind that order. We take it, we look at it, and we go, oh, this is a moral thing. God creates evil. I think God, because he knows how to put things in order, he knows how to unwind that. The Hebrew word is ra, and if God can create that order out of disorder, it must be reversible. And when you sin, that's what we're doing. We're unraveling some aspect of God's perfect order. When we sin against somebody, we very likely cause them to sin as well, because we get angry at them. We lie to them, that makes them mad, which makes them sin, and it goes on and on and on, and we're unraveling things. So I hope that makes the word evil make a little more sense, at least in the Tanakh, in the Torah, that the word evil is more of a unwinding and doesn't have to do so much with morality. Although we can tie morality to that, because if you're immoral, you're unwinding things. But I think it's a whole lot less subjective to think of it as unwinding God's holy, perfect order than trying to make some subjective idea about who's more evil than somebody else. So Genesis is an anchor to our understanding of God's perfection. The prophet Isaiah, in his Messianic statement in Isaiah 42, lays claim to the validity of the writing of the creation of the world. Starting in verse 5 of Isaiah 42, it says, "Thus says God, Adonai, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, the Ruach to those who walk in it. I, Adonai, called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, by opening blind eyes, bringing prisoners out of the dungeon, and sitting in darkness out, those sitting in darkness out of the prison house." He's created order. Isaiah is talking about it couple thousand years after creation itself. And then John uses the creation story in order to anchor Yeshua as Messiah. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All these things were made through him, and apart from him nothing was made that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered it. I love that passage. I just adore that passage, almost as much as the very beginning of Hebrews, where we get condensed the magnificence of God's creation. John lays out God's perfect order. And John doesn't expect his reader to do anything except that the Word was both with God and is God, and that he created all things, and the power of God's light. He doesn't ask for anybody's opinion on it. So there's a couple of key takeaways in Genesis that I want to conclude with that carry on through the apostolic writings. We covered this idea of evil, and what evil really is unwinding God's perfect order. But in Cain and Abel, we see that there are two men of different character traits. Cain may be creative in that he builds a city. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but Cain had some creativity in doing that. So he was a totally bad guy. But he falls prey to sin when it's lurking or crouching at the door. And humans are very much like Cain in that regard. Humans are otherwise very diverse in their character traits, but we're very much like Cain, because sin is always lurking at the door. And Cain is told that he can overcome that. It's not impossible. It's possible. You don't have to cave in to sin. The patriarchs that we read about in Genesis are righteous individuals, but they are nevertheless imperfect. That's the other thing. They didn't always know what path to take and had to make some choices. Some of those choices were wise, some of those were not wise. And through them, we begin to learn more and more about God and God's expectations, but we also realize that even the righteous, even the patriarchs and the matriarchs weren't perfect people, but they were beloved of God. Many heroes of the faith were imperfect, and that should make us happy to know that they were imperfect and we're imperfect, unless you think that you're perfect. And then I would say that you're imperfect because you think you're perfect. And many of the heroes of the faith were imperfect. All of them were imperfect. And that's what really makes Yeshua stand out in sharp contrast, because he was perfect. And then we also learned that humans are caretakers of the earth. Early on in the Garden of Eden, and we're still caretakers after being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. There were caretakers in the garden and then outside of the garden. Little difference is that outside of the garden, you worked by the sweat of your brow. And you probably grumbled a little bit too because of that. I don't like to sweat. So I would be a grumbler. Humans maintain creation now. We see that humans also change creation. You realize that ever since they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, humans have had a part in changing creation. Just at the very beginning, tilling the soil outside of the garden was changing creation. And tilling the soil for one family was one thing, but vast areas of the earth today are tilled. Trees are pruned and crossbred, animals crossbred. And when you're sick, you don't have to stay that way. You can go to the doctor. And that's changing creation, because if you were going to be stuck that way, you'd be stuck. But you can change where you're at and your health. So in a very broad way, we see that we are partners with God in creation. We're still caretakers of it. Our knowledge is increased through education. We're designed to be in partnership with God in maintaining the earth. We're asked to care for the poor, for the orphans, for widows, and for those who need justice, those who need love. And we are conduits of God's love and his kindness, and conduits of God's justice. And we are to proclaim that he is, that he exists, and that there is a Messiah, there is a Savior in the world. And we're partners that way too, both physically and spiritually, in proclaiming his word. And we discover something about ourselves in the opening pages of Genesis. One of them is, are we willing to accept that God is God and creator of all things, including us? Are we willing to accept the constraints that God puts on us and obey his teachings? Are we willing to be caretakers of the earth in concert with him? Are we willing to be spiritual caretakers in proclaiming the word out to the rest of the world and letting people know that he exists, that the word exists, the scriptures exist, and that there is a Savior? Do we know ourselves enough to see Genesis chapter 4, 6 through 7 in ourselves? Then Adonai said to Cain, why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, it will lift. But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the doorway. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. There's a key first. I mean, if you're trying to witness to somebody and trying to convince somebody that they have a sinful nature, here's a verse very early on in Genesis that, you know, you're just like Cain. You're susceptible to these things. But it's crouching at the doorway, and you must master it. And how do we master it today? The power of the Holy Spirit. You can't master it by yourself. You got to have the Holy Spirit. So the opening pages of Genesis sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. How Yeshua, the Messiah, conquers sin and death, setting everything right again. Taking the unraveling and making it perfect again. We will be able to live in God's perfect order once again. That day is coming. Revelation 22:1 says, the angel showed me a river, the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the city street. On every side of the river was a tree. What was that tree? Tree of life. Bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree were for healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in the city, and his servants shall serve him. They shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. I'll be able to look at you, and his name will be on your forehead. And you'll be able to look at me, and his name will be on my forehead. And then you see Genesis here. Again, the very beginning of Genesis. We already saw Genesis with the tree of life and all that. But here at the very beginning, night shall be no more. People have no need for lamplight or sunlight, for Adonai Elohim will shine on them, and they shall reign forever and ever, as we are absolutely back to God's perfect order, with no threat of it being unwound ever again. Baruch Hashem.
In the beginning, the world was a spark. God spoke in the void, lit up the dark. Order from chaos, his hands shaped the way. But sin crept in, led our hearts astray. Yet with his strength, we can rise and mend. Master the shadows, let order begin again. His word's a lamp, glowing soft on my feet. A light to my path where the truth and I meet. Yeshua shines, the world's beacon so bright, guiding us home through the deepest of nights. With every step, his love clears the way, order restored in the dawn of his day. By the river of life, where the trees' leaves unfold, no sun in the sky, for his glory is our goal. Forever we will stand in the light of his grace, order eternal in his holy embrace. His words a lamp, glowing soft on my feet, a light to my path where the truth and I meet. Yeshua shines, the world's beacon so bright, guiding us home through the deepest of nights. With every step, his love clears the way, order restored in the dawn of his day. By the river of life, where the trees' leaves unfold, no sun in the sky, for his glory is our goal.